Good afternoon, everybody. This is the webinar of the GEO Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, MBON. And today we have two guests, Francesco Gaetani and Pia Wiche. We are going to talk about the UN Environment's efforts on following the 2030 Agenda and hopefully have a discussion on how we can proceed or have a strategy for indicators for marine biodiversity as part of the 2030 Agenda and what the possible obstacles may be, what the possible opportunities may be. So we'll start with Francesco. I appreciate, Francesco and Pia, if you introduce yourselves at the beginning of your talks. And let's go.
Yes, sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Frank, for providing us with this opportunity. My name is Francesco Gaetani, and I'm from the Latin America and the Caribbean Office of UN Environment, or UNEP, which is the United Nations Environment Program of the UN Secretariat. I'm based in Panama City at the Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean, but the presentation that I'm going to show you is actually focusing on a global activity UN Environment is conducting in its capacity as a custodian of indicators belonging to Goal 14, Life Below Water. My role in the Latin American and the Caribbean office is being the coordinator for the division of science, which means working with countries and with the scientific community of the region of Latin America and the Caribbean, 33 countries from Mexico to Punta Arenas in Chile, including also the Caribbean, and working mostly on how to ensure that environmental change, ecosystems health, and in general environmental information is observed, stored, and communicated to policy and decision makers. So our focus is mostly on data, information, reports, and in general to all those activities that are at the very basis of the production of information, both for the general public and for decision and policy making. Today's presentation, it's very much focusing on a specific aspect of our work in the region, but again, this is a global activity, which is related to our role as a custodian of indicators from the Sustainable Development Goals, or Agenda 2030. And just to begin my presentation and to give you some background and context about my work, the role of our office and our agency in the big framework of the SDGs. I am based at the office in Panama. This is the office for Latin America and the Caribbean. This is only one of the several offices we have in the region, including a number of sub-regional offices. For instance, in the Caribbean, there is a specific office only for Caribbean countries, but also offices that are working at national level or offices that have been established in the framework of a project. So in this regard, having in mind the kind of distribution that UN Environment has, not only for Latin America, but globally with something like 25, 30 regional, sub-regional and national offices, what we are doing essentially as Division of Science is coordinating efforts and working with countries, essentially governments, and notably the ministries of environment, but also with research centers, the academia, and the private sector, for the establishment of a science policy interface. This science policy interface is, in our intention, is a platform or a mechanism to provide a straightforward and very direct source of information, which could be used by decision makers and policy makers, but also by the general public to access to a number of different data sets, indicators, reports, documents, and in general to data and information sources that are produced in the region and globally to report on the state of the environment. We are also working very much with countries, especially with countries, for building capacities on the use of data and information, but also to enhance capacities to produce usable and useful information that could be included in the methodological chains or operational chains that have been set up in the different countries or at regional level for reporting on the state of the environment. Okay, very quickly, this presentation is notably focusing on our role and our work as a custodian for SDG 14, but actually UN Environment is a custodian agency, which means is responsible for the production of the methodological sheet and for the collection of data from the countries towards the global level for a number of different indicators. Essentially 26 indicators belonging to different goals and including indicators that are part of SDG 6, which is water quality, fresh water, actually, water resources management, water sanitation, water-related ecosystems, but also SDG 8 and 12, which are relating to sustainable consumption and production, chemicals and waste, food waste, and other environmental themes that are very much related to society and economy. SDG 14, which is the topic for today's presentation. SDG 15, which is the SDG, the goal focusing on protected areas, mountains, conventions on biological diversity. And finally, eventually, SDG 17, which is the SDG focusing on partnerships for the implementation of the Agenda 2030 globally and at national level. Okay, coming now to the goal 14, life below water. Essentially, our role as a UN program or agency is to support countries in their daily work to track progress against the delivery of the SDG 14. And in particular, our technical work is focusing on three main indexes or indicators, which are the index of coastal eutrophication, or ICEP, and floating plastic debris density, the indicator on proportion of national exclusive economic zones managed using ecosystem-based approaches, and the indicator on coverage of protected areas in relation to marine areas. In this framework, and focusing on these three specific indicators, UN Environment and notably our colleagues in Nairobi, the headquarters of UN Environment, is working with a number of different scientific and institutional partners, including the regional Cs and other key partners, like, for instance, the European Union, to review the current forms and the current mechanisms that are in place for measuring coastal eutrophication, marine litter, and the management of marine areas. On top of this, and this is this review part of the work is actually an activity which is related also to the functioning of the so-called interagency and the expert group, which is the group that in the framework of the SDGs is producing the metadata or methodological sheets for the indicators. In addition to this, we are also working for a better visualization and communication of the indicators. For instance, we are working for a proposed dashboard of indicators in a way that, in this case, there might be a link between indicators 14 and indicators 6, which are related to fresh waters, and specifically to 632, which is the indicator on water quality. And also, we are working with other division of UN Environment, including the Ecosystems Division, which are working on more specific topics, focusing, for instance, on marine litter, microplastics, and in this case, for instance, eutrophication potential. All these activities are conducted in the framework of the interagency and expert group of the SDGs, which includes representatives from countries and from other specialized agencies. And the result of this work is actually a proposal for the adoption of a methodological sheet or metadata. It is worth mentioning that all these indicators, the 3 indicators, are belonging, unfortunately, still to Tier 3, which means these indicators, as of today, they don't have globally a robust and consistent data sets, which would be needed for their publication as official indicators of the SDG. And in addition, they don't have yet a consistent and universally agreed methodology. So this is a quite challenging work we are conducting at global level to try to upgrade these indicators from Tier 3 to Tier 2, which is the level used to indicate those indicators for which there is a lack of data or weak data, but there is a quite consistent and acceptable methodology agreed at global level for the publication, up to Tier 1, which are the indicators that actually are published because of the presence, the existence of consistent and relevant data and also methodology. In this case, in the case of these 3 indicators falling under SDG target, SDG 14, step-by-step methodology has been proposed and adopted for the production and publication of proxy indicators. And this is very much in line with the regional Cs core indicators that are published since many years, which are specifically focusing on chlorophyll A concentration which is a proxy indicators for eutrophication, and beach litter, which is a proxy indicators for marine plastic litter. And in the case of the indicator on ecosystem-based management in coastal zones, the proposed approach is considering the use of an indicator on integrated coastal zone management, or ICZM protocols. Well, focusing now on the first indicator of this set of 3 indicators, which is the indicator on index of coastal eutrophication, or ICEP, and floating plastic debris density. It is quite important here to say that there are essentially 2 types of indicators in this case. One first type of indicator is an indicator which is focusing and providing information on the cause of eutrophication, whereas the second type of indicator is focusing on the effects of eutrophication on ecosystems. Chlorophyll A is most frequent across the 18 regional seas programs, which are considered for the production of this global metadata for the production of this indicator. And that's the reason why this chlorophyll A has been considered and selected as a proxy for the production of this indicator. And as we will see in the next slides, regional seas programs are currently using 2 different methodologies for monitoring the presence and for actually also quantify the presence of chlorophyll A, which are essentially in situ measurements and remote sensing using satellite images. In this table, you can see the core and the supplementary monitoring parameters that have been proposed and approved for reporting on indicator 14.1.1. The core parameter is only one, as mentioned a few seconds ago, which is the chlorophyll A. This parameter is available from remote sensing, which is a clear advantage for most countries, especially because of the global scope of this work. But obviously, there is a number of additional supplementary parameters that could be considered by single countries to report on indicator 14.1.1, which includes nitrogen, phosphorus, dissolved oxygen, biological, chemical oxygen demand, turbidity, water clarity, transparency, and other parameters that are very much related to the quality of water, of seawater in this case. The current regional seas practices for the production of this indicator 14.1.1 are focusing mostly on, in the case of plastics or litter, are focusing on plastic debris washed or deposited on beaches or shorelines. And globally, beach litter is monitored by most of the regional seas. There are also some examples of monitoring of this parameter in the water column. For instance, in the case of Helsinki Commission or the Baltic Sea, or in the Mediterranean area, in this case, the Mediterranean Action Plan of UN Environment, but also in Asia. And also the plastic debris, the litter, could be monitored on the seafloor or the seabed. And in this case, there are 3 European regional seas programs that are using this parameter, reporting on this parameter, and the UN Environment, IOC, and JRC, European Commission work. And then lastly, the monitoring of this parameter and reporting on this parameter could also include the plastic ingested by biota, seabirds, fishes, etc. And in this case, you see here there are some interesting examples of how to produce this parameter, how to collect this parameter. Again, here you have a table with the core parameter, which is the aim is to have at global level all the countries or most of the countries reporting at least on the core parameter, which is in this case beach litter, based on surveys. Most of the countries actually are reporting on this parameter or have quite active production of this data. And then you have here a list, again, a quite comprehensive list of supplementary parameters that can be also considered to report on these specific indicators on plastic litter. Again, just to make sure my message is clear here, what we are presenting here is not really the marine plastic litter indicator or parameter itself, but it is a proxy to this indicator, which has been identified being these parameters mostly used or developed by regional seas programs in different countries. Okay, coming now to the second indicator or multiple indicator or set of indicators, which is the proportion of national exclusive economic zones managed using ecosystem-based approaches. In this case, what we can observe here is that this indicator is actually a policy indicator more than a statistical indicator or indicators, because actually we are speaking of multiple indicators that are producing a single indicators, in this case 14.2.1. And most of these parameters are indicators relating to measuring marine ecosystem types and quality. In this specific case, UN Environment headquarters in Nairobi is working with SCAP, which is the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, based in Bangkok, to develop a specific methodology for the production of these indicators. And specifically, the work is focusing on oceans accounting approach, which aims to capture marine ecosystems services and their links to economy and society. Also in this case, you have here a table of different parameters that are used to report on this indicator. You see, in this case, the core parameter is the existence of integrated coastal zone management plans, boundary and implementation status, but for sure there are other supplementary parameters that are suggested to be considered to report on these indicators. Focusing, for instance, on ecological parameters, state of biodiversity, water quality, habitat quality, ecosystem health. But again, this indicator is very much a policy indicator focusing on the policies that at national level, but also at local level, have been approved by countries for the management of ecosystems. Coming now to indicator 14.5.1, which is the third and final indicator for which UN Environment is producing a methodological sheet. In this case, we have a tier 1 indicator, which means an indicator for which we have a complete coverage globally, or in other words, we have or we assume to have very good data, consistent data, reliable data, and an established methodology for calculating the coverage of protected areas. As you know, as most of you, I think, are familiar, in this case, the data are actually the same data published through the World Database on Protected Areas, which is a project or an initiative being implemented by UN Environment in cooperation with the World Conservation Monitoring Center, or WCMC, at global level. The methodology for the establishment for the calculation of the coverage of protected areas is globally applicable. The data required at the national level is very minimal. It's not really needed big efforts from countries to report on that. And also in this case, we have a core parameter, which is the coverage of marine and coastal areas by protected areas, and then a number of supplementary parameters. In this case, the list is not exhaustive because we have a very long list of supplementary parameters that countries could consider, may want to consider when reporting on the implementation of this indicator, including the management effectiveness of protected areas, the connectivity of protected areas, the coverage, and the derived ecosystem services, and a number of other parameters and variables that are very much related to this important indicator. All this information, all this work that has been conducted by UN Environment in close cooperation with countries and with regional seas programs and other key partners, including the European Union, the Economic Commission for Asia and Pacific, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean partners. All this work and all the literatures and the different documents and practices that have been considered in this survey, for instance, have been included in a global manual on ocean statistics, which is now in its final draft, and I think it will be launched just this week at the occasion of a big conference IOC, UNESCO, and UN Environment are organizing in Paris. Essentially, this global manual on ocean statistics, you can Google it actually, and you will see you can download the draft, the final draft, and the annexes. These documents are already publicly available. But again, the main goal for this work is to support countries in their effort to track progress against the delivery of the SDG 14, and specifically for these three key indicators, for which, in the case of many countries, we don't still have very consistent data, and for which it is important to agree on a global methodology. Yes, I think it is important to mention here that the methodology, actually methodologies and metadata that have been to the interagency expert group are methodologies of metadata that are intended for the production of global indicators, which are those indicators that all the countries, for which all the countries have essentially agreed to report on. But it is a fact. It is also worth mentioning. Countries they have the opportunity to develop their own national indicators, or at regional level, there may be the case where a single region, like for instance, I don't know, the Caribbean or the Andean region or the Sahel zone in Africa or South Asia or other specific region with very specific ecosystems, for instance, they may want to develop specific indicators from SDG 14 that are relevant and pertinent to the specificity of the considered region. So this global manual and the methodologies that are proposed in this manual are referring to the global indicators only. But it is a matter of fact that countries or regional organizations or regional institutions, they are also working for developing specific indicator frameworks that could be or will be used at regional level. Okay, this is my last slide, just to mention you the way forward or next steps as UN Environment, working at global level. In 2017, UN Environment conducted pilot testing in Fiji and Colombia, but we are in contact with other countries now, and we are trying to have to develop new workflows and to work more closely with countries for developing methodologies, metadata that are really consistent and usable by countries. The link between what is called the framework for development of environmental statistics, which is the official framework of statistics approved by UN, the United Nations Statistics Division. The link between this framework, this official framework, and the parameters of the SDG, it is not easy to identify. It is not really easy to include or analyze a parameter considering its physical value and, for instance, the way how this parameter is built within the official framework for statistics. And this is a big issue. This is a challenging because, for instance, developing an indicator framework within a context of a scientific community is not always then easy to translate all this work in what the national offices or Institute of Statistics are intended to report on, for instance, the implementation of the SDG or for other statistical tasks. So here, yes, we still have some issue in building a more robust and solid link between the statistical world and the statistical community and the community of scientists and experts from ministries of environment that are working on specific parameters that could be used to inform a specific indicator. This link is not yet that evident in some cases, and our work as UN Environment is exactly this: is trying to build or fill this gap between the statistical community and the community of scientists and experts that are working on physical parameters, focusing on environment. And then, as mentioned a few minutes ago, for the SDG and specifically for indicator 14, UN Environment is proposing regional monitoring by the regional seas, which means trying to coordinate the activities and the production of these indicators that is usually a nation trying to coordinate this workflow at regional level through the regional seas programs. And then from the regional seas programs fit into the global monitoring system. In this case, the UNSD system, or United Nations Statistical Division. And this role of regional mechanism could also be elaborated in this big statistical framework. And again, this is a gap we have in this moment, and we are working to try to build this link very much needed between the statistical community and this framework for environmental statistics and the work that the scientific community, yourselves, and the experts from the ministries are doing for reporting and monitoring on the state of the environment. Okay, that was pretty much all. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Francesco. I really appreciate it. This was a very good and very timely presentation. There were a lot of details here that I have not heard before. We are running a little late, so Pia has agreed to do her webinar next month. So we will have Pia Wisha. Yeah. No, that's okay, Francesco. This was very interesting, but I wanted to have some time, and we have perhaps 15 minutes or so that we can talk as a group on some of the points that you raised here. And Pia is, of course, also on the line, and I really appreciate her willingness to talk about her part of the presentation, which is challenges of creating and using indicators for decision making in public policy. And we will try to schedule her for next month. So basically, the next MBON webinar next month is going to be the second half of what we were going to do today. But in the meantime, we can open the conversation with Francesco and with Pia, and there's a number of people online. It's not a huge group, so I would appreciate if anybody has a comment that you identify yourself, saying who you are, why, or what you're interested in. So please go ahead. I have a couple of questions myself, but I'd like to let people to interact with you, Francesco.
Sure, thank you. And sorry, Pia, for that. It's always my issue to running out of time during my presentation. I was looking, oh, here, okay. Sure. Should you have any question or comments, I'm very much happy to answer them.
All right, so Frank, may I?
Yes, please, go ahead, Pierre.
All right, hi, Francis, thank you very much for your talk. Just landed from Vancouver, so I missed the first part, unfortunately, but I think I get the gist. This is very interesting, and I'm just wondering if you're aware of the UNESCO IODE, IOC Ocean Best Practice Repository. That's something that's been reinvigorated through Atlantos, and we're collecting best practices and methodologies across ocean observing. And in a sense, since you're going to be there next week, you might have the chance to talk to some people involved. It sounds like that could be a natural home for both the global and regional best practice manuals, the ones that you're generating. And there's a lot to say about that system, but I just want that to be on your radar. That's one comment. Second comment, since 2014, we've been working on an ontology for the SDGs. It's called SDGIO. It's an interface ontology. So that's like a machine representation of human knowledge. This was started by Jacqueline McGlade from UN Environment, and it's being run by the Nairobi office, Ludgard Coppens, etc. And that is where we're trying to gather these, let's say, different modes of measuring certain SDG indicators that are disaggregated at the national and regional level. So that might be an interesting place to start adding some of these definitions that you're talking about, the regional ones, so that it's represented in a UN data system, and maybe we can build around that. I just want to see if you have reactions to those ideas, if it's something we can explore.
Yeah, thank you very much for your comment. Actually, very, very, very good comment. What I can say, what I can tell you on that is that, I think next Wednesday through Thursday in Paris, there will be a workshop organized by UN Environment for the presentation of this global manual on ocean statistics. And IOC is also attending this workshop. And I understand they will discuss this opportunity to enhance cooperation and find synergies between the different agencies and programs that are working on data and information on oceans, including the idea to develop a sort of common activity on best practice from regional seas and other programs on oceans. And then on ontology, yes, you're right. It was a kind of very important topic for all of us working at the Division of Science. And Jacqueline McLeod, actually, she was my boss at that time, the director of the Division of Science. And we advanced, there is a quite meaningful advancement on this. The idea was to develop an ontology for the indicators of these SDGs that are related to the environmental dimension of the SDGs. But actually, maybe it would be better to be in contact with my colleagues from Nairobi on this specific activity. And specifically, sure, my colleague Gillian Campbell is the statistician that is working on that, and she's very much. I mean, she would be very happy to give you some update on this activity. Unfortunately for Nairobi, it's quite late now, so they couldn't join this call.
Yes, of course. I think we can follow up on that separately, but thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions?
Francesco, this is Enrique.
Hi, Enrique.
This is Enrique Montes from the University of South Florida and the Marine Biodiversity Observation Network. Francesco, thank you very much for this very good presentation. Excellent material. I'm just wondering if the supplementary indicators that you highlighted in these tables are they highlighted as in the metadata file, or they become indicators themselves that are presented as the core indicators, or how does it? What's the interaction between supplementary and core indicators or metrics?
Okay, the rationale to have core indicators and supplementary indicators is that the SDG agenda is a universal global agenda. So countries with very different capacities for the production of data. So the idea was to agree on a very minimal set, in this case one, parameter to be reported to inform these indicators, the 3 indicators. So the idea is to have all the countries, or most of the countries, or the maximum number of the countries reporting at least on the core parameters, and then to have a smaller but significant number of countries reporting also on the other supplementary parameters. But yes, this is a work in progress. So, for instance, I'm not myself very much knowledgeable on indicator 14, but for indicator 6 and indicator 632, for instance, which is a water quality for fresh water, there is a set of five parameters, which are physical parameters, which is the minimum set of parameters needed to monitor water quality. And countries are committed to report on these 5 indicators. And UN Environment is actually working at regional level, at global level, to help countries to report on these parameters. I understand the same is happening here for indicators 14. And the idea is to have all the country or most of the country reporting on core parameters. And then for the way forward for next year's work, the idea is to have supplementary parameters becoming core parameters, especially those supplementary parameters that are critical for reporting on specific issues.
Thank you, Francesco. I'm going to ask a challenge question, and I know Pia is going to talk about challenges in the next scheduled telecon. But one of the things that we're doing, I mean, one of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals is to address life on Earth and the sustainability of life in a good way, and of course how it benefits people. And yet I find that the indicators don't address biodiversity very effectively or at all. And that's a big challenge because it's so difficult to address biodiversity in just life in general, no? So how would what is the possible approach that we can take to look at some simple measure that is tractable by these different countries in terms of life in the sea, and ideally something to say, track how biodiversity and how life in the sea is changing?
That's a big question. Well, my feeling is that at this point in time, we have just begun our, journey. And what is happening now is trying to build those capacities that are needed to have most of the countries, ideally all the countries, reporting on most of the indicators. So that's the reason why, for instance, a relatively large number of indicators are not that meaningful to you as scientists. Probably are not really focusing on key issues that are related in this case to oceans and seas. But again, the idea is to try to reach this minimum level at global level for reporting on the implementation of the Agenda 2030. And for sure, obviously, the scientific community has a key role to play in this framework, because once all the countries will be really able to report, or most of the countries will be able to report on this indicator or parameters, it would be possible for them to enhance their capacity to investigate and report on specific key parameters or variables that are representing key phenomena or dynamics or processes which are related to ocean ecosystems.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think that this might be a very practical answer to Frank's question, and I'm sure that this is going to be totally insufficient for the community here gathered in this webinar. But there is one indicator that everyone can measure, or well, not everyone, but it's easier to measure, and that it tracks biodiversity in the oceans, and that is 1441. That's a proportion of fish stocks within the biologically sustainable levels. And I am aware that just tracking the fish stocks is totally insufficient to track the status of the oceans. But then if we think about the role of fish stocks, these are normally fish high above in the food chain. So we can use them, perhaps, you're the experts, perhaps they could be used as biological indicators of the status of these food chains. And if we just restore the balance with those fish stocks, then we can help restore the balance down, all the way down the food chain, down and up, right? Depending on which stock we're speaking about. So although very basic, there are a couple of indicators related to biodiversity within the SDGs. If you haven't had the chance to see them yet, I would invite you to go to unstats.un.org/sdgs/metadata. That's where all the metadata is. You can just filter around with keywords such as fisheries or fish stocks, for instance, and get to the indicators that are not all related to biodiversity. Some also have to do with how much is being invested in the protection of biodiversity in the countries. So maybe that's a way to look at it, Frank. Just a bit more information.
No, that's great. I really appreciate it. And yet I think that these are still also tier 3, the fisheries indicators are, and those are.
No, not this one, not 1441. It already has metadata, so
okay.
So it's not tier 3. It's already there. You can download it already.
And one of the issues is, of course, that the fisheries statistics are followed by landings, and so it's a fisheries dependent indicator, and the custodian is FAO. So we would like to get 2 other indicators. For example, the diversity of lower trophic levels like microbes and phytoplankton, and intermediate levels of diversity. And then there's the diversity issues in the deep sea, which is now targeted for mining and other types of development, in addition to fishing. So there's other aspects that we want to move forward on. We want to move forward also and pressure the industry to develop new sensors for measuring life in the sea in a way that's not been done before. So that's one of the challenges in front of the science community. And we agree that at the moment, talk about capacity. I mean, most countries don't have a way to measure many things in the sea anyway. So we need to develop the technology and the capacity to measure those minimum sets of variables that Francesco talked about. But we want to go beyond fisheries dependent statistics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So the main issue here, I think, it's really to, first of all, there is, I think, a cultural issue, because the SDG framework, well, not really a cultural issue, sorry for that, is probably the fact that the SDG, the Agenda 2030 and the SDGs have been developed in a framework which is based mostly on the work that the national statistical offices are doing to report not only on the state of the environment, but also for social, and mostly for social and economic variables. So the first obstacle towards a more comprehensive, or if you wish, a more ambitious approach to report on the state of the environment, including probably more interesting indicators from a scientific point of view, is to have these statistical institutes or offices being ready to develop this information, which means capacity at national level for the production of such indicators, which is a long way to go, because most of the people working at statistical offices or statistical institutes, they do have a very good preparation and background on statistics, but in most cases they don't have really any kind of background, scientific background on oceans or forests or whatever. So that's a first gap, if you wish. Strengthening the environmental statistics at national level, which is the first step, or, as I mentioned before, bridging the gap or building the link between the community that is already producing data, statistics and indicators for the environment and the statistical institutes or the statistical offices. Because the SDG framework has a quite structured structure, which is based on the fact that the statistical offices at national level are the institutions mandated to report on the implementation of the Agenda 2030. So this is a very first gap we have. Being these statistical offices at national level more, open and able to process this information and familiar to this information, and build at national level these links between the ministers of environment, for instance, and the statistical offices. And then it is really critical to engage with the scientific community. But this is, for instance, what the economic commissions are doing at regional level. In a month, we will have a meeting in Santiago of the Statistical Commission of the Americas, where a number of scientists and experts from the region will present and will provide some highlights and examples of what they are doing, not only for the environment, but what they are doing to simulate non-conventional data coming from a non-conventional source of information into the official statistics of the country, which is the way through which we will have to go if we want to include in this SDG indicator framework other indicators with probably more meaningful and interesting parameters. So we are working on that. It's a quite difficult and challenging objective, but this is probably the future of these indicator frameworks. Trying to work more closely with the community and trying to have these statistical offices capacitated and able to produce this kind of information, which is not the case now for most of the country.
Thank you. We're starting to go over the hour. I'm going to leave the call open as long as there are questions. I know that Pierluigi has some comments. I would like to encourage Francesco to stay involved with this group. What you just mentioned in terms of having non-conventional methods and indicators is of great interest to us, especially from a remote sensing point of view and what we can contribute globally to countries and how do we do that. So we're in the search for these types of answers. So Pierluigi, you had a question?
Yeah, it's more like a reaction to this because it feels like there's a natural convergence happening. Because again, when we set up that interface ontology for the SDGs with the UN Environment Nairobi office, this was exactly the reason. Because the core set of the indicators that had been selected, as Francisco said, are for feasibility, they're for practicability on a global scale. But we know that there will be more data streams coming out there, some of which are very structured, and some which are emerging, like the EOVs. Some of which are structured, EPVs, etc. So the goal was to create an interface, that's why it's called the interface ontology, between the core indicators and then other data streams that are fit for purpose, alerting the statistical departments to their presence, and perhaps then motivating the next round of indicators as the process matures, and maybe allowing people to use it right away. There are many groups that are using such data streams. So I think we have something to actually begin laying a foundation for ocean data streams to meet the indicators and the indicator process. I think there's a really a good potential in continuing this discussion.
Yeah, sure.
Other comments? Okay, calling twice. Other comments?
Frank, let me make, this is Jay Crone, make just one comment. As these marriage between the statistics offices and the work that's being done here occur, and then the work in the science community, for some of the plankton, for some of the others, we're going to be moving toward autonomous monitoring systems. And so we need to begin to ask how to base statistics not on conventional fish catches, but in some of the more complex autonomous operations. I think it'd be a worthwhile exercise to engage in sometime.
Yes, it is. This is a very good point, Jay, and I want to have UN Environment follow the efforts that the oceanographic community is developing on ocean observing. There's a meeting, it's called Ocean Ops 19, that is planned for September in Hawaii next year. There's the Ocean Ops Research Coordination Network, and there's several groups like this Marine Biodiversity Observation Network. We're all trying to address Sustainable Development Goal targets, and so there's a big challenge in the science community on how to communicate with the UN if people have ideas, and I know that there's hundreds of potential indicators that are being proposed, but nobody really understands the process to make one useful or used by people in the UN statistical offices or in the country statistical offices. So that's a challenge that that's why we're having these webinars, and that's one of the things that I think a lot of people are interested in understanding.
I think, Frank, that you just made a fantastic introduction for my webinar next month. So thanks a lot.
Great.
We will be talking about what's the process to generate an indicator and what are all the stages, well, not all, but just a few, just a sample of the stages that have to happen, that an indicator goes through to become alive and used by governments.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, I also want to suggest that we have different times so that we have other people around the world participate at that time, maybe not at this time. We have always had the webinars at this hour, but we lose half the world, so maybe we should have it maybe even 8 or 12 hours earlier in the day. So it's something to talk about, Pia. We will be coordinating with you on the title and distributing the information for the next webinar. So before we hang up, any other comments?
My only comment, Francesco, here is that it would be probably useful for you to be in contact with my colleagues in Nairobi that are working at global level on this. I myself, I'm a humbly regional officer working with countries here in the region, the big region of Latin America and the Caribbean, but I don't really have a global, perspective on that.
Yes, Francesco, I'm going to send you an email, and Mitch Roffer, who's a part of our Marine Biodiversity Observation Network, is in Africa right now until the end of the month, and he has offered to go to Nairobi. So we're planning, and we talked to Ileana Lopez, so we have an email conversation going on with Ileana, but maybe we will involve you and Pia to see what Mitch could do in visiting the UN headquarters over there in Nairobi. And so I will write you about that.
Good, perfect.
Francesco, so thank you so much. This was very good, and I appreciate everybody's patience and hanging out for over the hour. But Francesco, I really, really appreciate it. And Pia, thank you so much again for being there and for being available for next time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Looking
everybody.
forward. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Good night, good evening.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.